My name is Kalagala Kanyago. I come from Uganda. I work with Uganda Christian University, Faculty of Law, and I'm a master's student of Faculty of Law at Makerere University. At Uganda Christian University, I teach gender and the law. So the UN-GEST program tied in well with my work back home, and I sought to come and acquire more knowledge and skills that I would pass on to my students, that I would use to incorporate in my course design back home. While at the program here, we've been taught a number of things, and during my final assignment, using the concepts on gender that we've been taught throughout the program, I looked at integrating a gender perspective within the employment law in Uganda, and this was aimed at engendering employment relationships. And in my final assignment, I asked two questions: how the law describes society, men and women, and how can gender be more integrated in law so that it can address biases within the law. And so when I looked at the law in Uganda, the Employment Act, I analyzed the Employment Act. It was an academic journal. When I looked at the Employment Act, I realized that it has a goal of promoting gender equality. However, it's the framework, the architect of the law itself is still lacking. There are extreme long hours. Employers and employees can arrange for extreme long hours. So this is not favorable for employees who have family responsibilities, for example. And then I also looked at paid leave provisions. And the reason I looked at the leave provisions was because most employees, there's a broad spectrum of employees in my country. We have men, women with responsibilities, elderly people. So most employees actually need, provisions for care, because everyone at one time within the employment relationship might need to care. So having the provisions on care is so important to the employment law. And lastly, I looked at how the employment law looks at unvalidated work practices. And the reason I looked at this is because if you look at the definition of discrimination in the employment law, it doesn't address indirect discrimination. And employment in Uganda, employment structures, since women traditionally were not engaged in paid employment, so structures were mainly based on men, and the systems were really designed around a male subject. So you realize that these discriminatory, exclusionary practices still exist. And employees who feel that they're being discriminated against should have a legal remedy where they can actually be interpreted and say these practices are not good, they unfairly exclude one sex. So that's why I'm looking at the legal provisions on discrimination and the fact that the Employment Act does not have a provision on indirect discrimination. So in my recommendations for my article, I recommended that the current employment law should contain a provision on the right to care, because all people in all walks of life have instances where they will need to care for their loved ones, parents, elderly parents, children, friends. And then I also recommended that there should be some restrictions on working hours so that people have time to reconcile unpaid work with paid work, especially for women who are traditionally given the responsibility to take care of families. Then lastly, I recommended that the Employment Act should include a provision on indirect discrimination to address the unvalidated workplace structures. And my basis was the fact that the government of Uganda has an obligation under international human rights instruments and under the 1995 Constitution to design better laws to accord both women and men full dignity and ensure that gender equality is realized. And I believe that gender equality can only be realized in law, and specifically within the employment law, if a gender perspective is brought to it.